My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso, a nation in West Africa where the land is dry, the people are strong, and faith still guides many hearts. But today I am not speaking to you as a politician. I am speaking to you as a man who faced a moment that tested his conscience, his faith, and his responsibility to millions of people. Many of you watching may be older than I am. Some of you may have lived through wars, economic crises, political changes, and moments when the world seemed uncertain. You understand something that younger generations sometimes forget. Power is temporary, but truth remains. In the past few years, I have spoken openly about injustice in the world, not because I enjoy criticizing anyone, not because I wish to provoke powerful nations, but because the teachings of Jesus Christ have always spoken clearly about hypocrisy, corruption, and oppression. Jesus stood before kings and religious authorities and told them truths that many people were too afraid to say. He warned about leaders who love wealth more than justice. He spoke about those who burden the poor while protecting their own power. And when I read the gospel, I see something very simple. A call for leaders to serve people, not exploit them. Over the past years, I began quoting the words of Jesus in some of my public speeches, especially when speaking to young Africans who feel forgotten by the world. One speech in particular became widely known. It took place in Ouagadougou during the African Youth Conference in September of 2025. During that speech, I quoted a verse from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money." Those words are over 2,000 years old, yet they describe the modern world with painful accuracy. Because today, more than 700 million people across our planet still live in extreme poverty. At the same time, corruption drains more than $1 trillion from developing nations every year. Money that should build hospitals, money that should educate children, money that should give hope to the next generation. Instead, that wealth disappears into private accounts, secret deals, and political corruption. I spoke about these realities because silence would make me complicit, and because the teachings of Jesus have always stood against injustice. But the more I spoke, the more uncomfortable certain powerful leaders became. Some people began to say that I was mixing faith with politics. Others said that my words were creating unnecessary tension. At first, these criticisms were quiet. Then they became louder. And eventually, something happened that I never expected. Pressure began to come from places far beyond Africa. Messages were sent. Warnings were delivered. Meetings were requested behind closed doors. They did not like that the words of the gospel were being used to expose corruption and hypocrisy. And then, on the morning of March 10th, 2026, something arrived at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. A diplomatic envelope. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary message from foreign partners. But when I opened that letter, I realized that the situation had changed. What I read inside that envelope would lead to one of the most difficult decisions of my life. And the events that followed would surprise the entire world. If you want to understand what truly happened, then you must first hear about the letter that arrived that morning. That is where the story truly begins. The morning of March 10th, 2026 began quietly at the Kosiom Presidential Palace in Ouagadougou. The air was warm, and the city was slowly waking up. From my office window, I could see the streets beginning to fill with motorbikes and small buses carrying people to work. For millions of citizens in Burkina Faso, that morning was no different from any other. But inside the presidential palace, something unexpected was about to happen. A few minutes after 8 in the morning, my chief of staff, Captain Omar Yabre, entered my office carrying a sealed diplomatic envelope. He placed it on the desk in front of me. I could see immediately that this was not an ordinary document. The envelope carried several official seals. One came from the United States Department of State in Washington. The other came from the European Union's Committee on Foreign Affairs in Brussels. At first, I assumed it was related to regional security. For more than a decade, the Sahel region of Africa had been facing serious instability. From the year 2015 to 2025, more than 3,000 terrorist attacks had taken place across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Those attacks had taken more than 15,000 lives. Entire communities had been displaced. Villages had been destroyed. Families had been forced to abandon their homes and travel hundreds of kilometers in search of safety. Because of that situation, communications between African governments and Western governments often focused on security cooperation. So when I saw the envelope, I believed it would likely discuss military coordination, intelligence sharing, or humanitarian assistance. But when I opened the letter and began reading, I realized something was different. The message had been signed by two prominent international officials. One signature belonged to the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. The other signature belonged to the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell. The letter began with formal diplomatic language. It spoke about international cooperation, global stability, and mutual respect between nations. But as I continued reading, the tone slowly changed. Instead of discussing security or development, the letter began referencing my public speeches. Several of them, but one speech in particular, the speech I had delivered at the African Youth Conference in Ouagadougou the previous year. That speech had taken place in September of 2025. Thousands of young Africans had gathered there. Many of them were students. Many were entrepreneurs trying to build businesses in difficult conditions. Many were simply searching for hope in a world where opportunities often seem limited. During that speech, I spoke openly about leadership and about responsibility, but I also spoke about faith. I quoted a verse from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money." Those words were not directed at any specific country. They were directed at a universal problem: corruption. Across the world today, corruption continues to steal opportunities from ordinary people. More than 700 million human beings still live in extreme poverty. Yet every year, more than $1 trillion disappears from developing nations through corruption and financial manipulation. That money could transform entire continents. It could build schools. It could build hospitals. It could build infrastructure that gives young people a future. But instead, much of it disappears into private accounts, into secret deals, into systems that protect the powerful while leaving the poor behind. During that speech in Ouagadougou, I said something very simple. A leader who serves money instead of justice cannot claim to serve the people. I believe those words reflected the teachings of Jesus. And I believe they reflected the moral responsibility of leadership. But as I read the diplomatic letter that morning, I realized that some people had interpreted my words differently. The letter stated that my speech had raised concerns among several international partners. It suggested that certain statements could be interpreted as criticism of global political and economic systems. And then it said something that caught my attention. The letter claimed that the use of religious language in political speeches could create misunderstandings in international dialogue. I paused for a moment when I read that sentence, because I knew the teachings of Jesus were never meant to create misunderstanding. They were meant to reveal truth. The letter continued for several more pages. Its language remained polite, careful, diplomatic, but the meaning behind the words was becoming increasingly clear. Some leaders did not like hearing the teachings of the gospel used to criticize corruption. Some leaders did not like hearing that wealth should not come before justice. And some leaders did not like hearing a young African president speaking about moral responsibility in front of thousands of people. Still, the letter did not contain any direct demands. It ended by expressing hope that future speeches would focus primarily on development and cooperation. That phrase stayed in my mind. Focus primarily on development and cooperation. In other words, speak about economics. Speak about security. But do not speak about faith. Do not speak about morality. Do not speak about the teachings of Jesus. I placed the letter back on the desk. For a few moments I said nothing. Capitaine Yabre stood quietly across from me. He had already read the message. He knew exactly what it implied. Finally he spoke. "Mr. President," he said softly, "this may not be the end of it." I understood what he meant. In diplomacy, the first message is often only the beginning. Sometimes it is a warning. Sometimes it is a test. And sometimes it is simply the first step in applying pressure. At that moment, I did not yet know which one it was, but I had a strong feeling that the story was not finished. 3 days later, that feeling would prove correct, because another letter would arrive. And this time, the message would be much clearer and much more serious. Before we continue to that second letter, let me share the central truth that was already becoming clear to me. The teachings of Jesus are powerful, not because they belong to one nation, not because they belong to one church, but because they challenge every form of injustice. When leaders become uncomfortable with those teachings, it often reveals something deeper. And in the days ahead, that deeper reality would become impossible to ignore. If you wish to understand how the pressure increased, then you must hear about what happened next. 3 days later, another envelope arrived, and the tone of the message had changed. After receiving the first diplomatic letter, I tried to return my attention to the daily responsibilities of governing a country. Running a nation leaves little room for distraction. Every day brings decisions about security, economic stability, food supply, and the welfare of millions of citizens. Burkina Faso is a country of more than 22 million people, and nearly 40% of them still live below the poverty line. That reality is never far from my mind. Every decision made inside the presidential palace can affect the lives of families in distant villages, farmers struggling with drought, teachers trying to educate children with limited resources, young people hoping for opportunities that their parents never had. For that reason, I tried not to overinterpret the first letter. Diplomatic disagreements happen all the time. Nations speak frankly with each other behind closed doors. Sometimes messages are sent simply to express concern, but something about that letter continued to stay with me. It was not the words themselves. It was the intention behind them. The suggestion that quoting the teachings of Jesus might somehow create problems in international relations seemed strange to me. After all, the moral teachings of Christ have influenced leaders for centuries. Presidents, kings, and prime ministers throughout history have spoken about faith. They have quoted scripture in moments of crisis and hope. So why was it suddenly considered inappropriate when an African leader did the same? For several days, I continued working as usual. Meetings were held with ministers. Security reports were reviewed. Discussions about agricultural programs and infrastructure projects filled the schedule. But on the morning of March 13, 2026, another message arrived. This time, it did not come directly from Washington or Brussels. Instead, it arrived through the United States Embassy in Burkina Faso. The message was delivered through the office of the American ambassador, Sandra Clark. Unlike the first letter, which had been delivered quietly, this one arrived with greater urgency. My staff informed me that the embassy had requested immediate confirmation that the document had been received. That alone suggested that the tone had changed. When the envelope was brought into my office, I noticed that it was much shorter than the previous letter. But sometimes shorter messages carry heavier meaning. I opened it slowly and began to read. The diplomatic language was still present, but the caution that had filled the first letter was gone. The message was now far more direct. It began by referencing the earlier communication sent on March 10th. Then it addressed my public statements once again. Specifically, the letter referred to speeches where I had spoken about corruption and moral responsibility using the teachings of Jesus. According to the message, these statements were creating concern among several Western partners. The letter said that such remarks could increase international political tension. It also warned that they might damage relations between Burkina Faso and its Western partners. When I read that sentence, I paused, because speaking about justice should never damage relationships between nations. Speaking about honesty should never threaten international cooperation. Yet the letter continued. And then it mentioned something that was clearly meant to remind me of Burkina Faso's economic situation. The message stated that Burkina Faso currently receives approximately $450 million in development assistance each year from the United States and the European Union. That figure was not new information. Our government works closely with many international partners on development programs. Those funds support healthcare, food programs, and infrastructure. But the way the number appeared in the letter made its purpose very clear. It was not simply information. It was a reminder. A reminder that financial support can also become political leverage. The message did not yet contain an ultimatum, but the tone had shifted. The first letter had expressed concern. This second letter carried something closer to a warning. It said that continued public statements linking Christian teachings with criticism of political leadership could complicate diplomatic relationships. In other words, they were asking me to change how I spoke. Not about economic policy, not about military strategy, but about faith. They wanted those words removed from the conversation. As I continued reading, I began to understand the deeper issue. The teachings of Jesus challenge systems that place wealth above human dignity. They challenge leaders who exploit power. They challenge societies where corruption becomes normalized. And when those teachings are spoken publicly, they make certain people uncomfortable. That discomfort was now becoming visible in diplomatic language. After finishing the letter, I set it down on my desk. For several minutes, I remained silent. Not because I was angry, but because I was thinking about the larger implications. Burkina Faso is not the most powerful country in the world. We are not a superpower. We do not possess vast economic influence. But every nation, large or small, deserves dignity. And every leader must decide whether truth can be spoken freely. Later that afternoon, I met with several members of my advisory team. We reviewed the letter together. No one in the room seemed surprised by its tone. In fact, several advisors believed that stronger pressure might follow. One of them said something that stayed with me. He said, "Mr. President, sometimes the real issue is not what you said. The real issue is that you said it publicly." He was right. Many leaders discuss corruption privately. Many governments acknowledge injustice behind closed doors. But speaking openly about moral responsibility, especially before international audiences, can disturb powerful interests. The more I reflected on the letter, the clearer the situation became. The first message had been a signal. The second message was a warning, and I began to sense that a third step might follow. Something more direct. Something that would require a clear answer from me. But before that moment arrived, I spent several evenings reflecting on what truly matters in leadership. Because leadership is not only about power, it is also about conscience. A president can make decisions based on fear, or a president can make decisions based on conviction. History is full of examples of both. At that moment, however, the real challenge had not yet arrived. The letters had expressed concern. They had delivered warnings, but they had not yet made a direct demand. That would come next. And when it did, the choice placed before me would become impossible to ignore. Because the next message would not simply suggest changes, it would present a condition that forced me to choose between two things that should never be placed against each other: my faith and my position as president of Burkina Faso. The moment the demand arrived, the situation changed completely, and the world would soon be watching. By the time the second letter arrived, I already sensed that the situation was changing. Diplomacy often moves slowly, but when pressure begins to build, it usually follows a clear pattern. First comes a quiet message, then comes a warning, and eventually a demand. The document delivered through the American embassy on March 13th felt like the moment when that pattern became visible. I sat in my office at Koshim Palace and read the message again, this time more carefully. Every word had been chosen with precision. Diplomatic language rarely raises its voice, but it often carries meaning between the lines. Experienced leaders learn to read not only what is written, but what is implied. This letter was no longer simply expressing concern about speeches. It was beginning to outline consequences. The message repeated something that had already appeared in the earlier communication. It said that my public remarks, especially those quoting the teachings of Jesus to criticize corruption, were creating unnecessary tension in international political discussions. That phrase seemed strange to me, because truth has often created tension throughout history. When prophets spoke about injustice, tension followed. When reformers challenged corruption, tension followed. Even in the time of Jesus himself, speaking truth created tension with powerful authorities. Yet the letter suggested that avoiding such tension should be a priority. Then the message moved to a different subject: development assistance. The document reminded me again that Burkina Faso receives approximately $450 million in annual development support from Western partners. The letter explained that these funds support humanitarian programs, security initiatives, and economic development. All of that was true. International partnerships can help nations overcome serious challenges. But again, the way the information was presented carried a deeper meaning. The number was being used as a form of pressure. It was a reminder that economic support can also become a tool of influence. The letter continued by saying that some Western partners were becoming increasingly concerned about the direction of Burkina Faso's public messaging on the international stage. They suggested that linking religious teachings with criticism of global political leadership might create misunderstandings about the country's diplomatic position. When I read that sentence, I paused again. Because I had never spoken against any specific nation. I had spoken against corruption. I had spoken against injustice. And I had spoken about moral responsibility. Those principles do not belong to one country or one ideology. They belong to humanity itself. Still, the message continued. And then something new appeared. The letter proposed what it described as a constructive step forward. That phrase is often used in diplomacy when a condition is about to be presented. According to the document, Western partners believed it would be helpful if I clarified something publicly. Specifically, they suggested that I issue a statement explaining that my personal religious beliefs should not be interpreted as part of Burkina Faso's official political messaging. At first glance, that request might sound reasonable. Many leaders separate personal faith from political speech. But that was not exactly what the letter was asking. As I continued reading, the meaning became clearer. They were not simply asking for clarification. They were asking for silence. The document said that future public speeches should avoid quoting religious teachings when discussing political or economic issues. In other words, the teachings of Jesus should not be used to criticize corruption. They should not be used to speak about injustice. They should remain private, hidden, separate from the public conversation. I leaned back in my chair after reading that sentence. Because what they were asking was not a small adjustment. They were asking me to change the foundation of my message. For me, faith is not something that exists only inside a church building. Faith influences how a person sees the world. It shapes ideas about justice. It shapes ideas about responsibility. And for many people around the world, including millions in Africa and millions in the United States, the teachings of Jesus have always been connected to moral leadership. Think about history. Many of the leaders who fought against slavery spoke about their faith. Many who struggled for civil rights spoke about the gospel. Faith has often been the moral language that reminds societies of their responsibilities. So why should that language suddenly disappear from political life? That question remained in my mind as I finished reading the letter. But the most important part of the message had not yet appeared. It came in the final paragraph. There, the tone changed again. The document stated that failure to address these concerns could lead to a reassessment of certain cooperative agreements between Burkina Faso and Western partners. That phrase might sound vague, but in diplomacy, reassessment often means reconsidering financial support, security partnerships, and political recognition. It was the clearest signal yet that the situation was escalating. The letter did not yet give a deadline. It did not yet present a direct ultimatum, but it was clearly preparing the ground for one. After I finished reading, I looked across the desk at Capitaine Umar Yebre. He understood immediately what the message meant. For several seconds we said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "Mr. President," he said, "this may only be the beginning." I nodded, because by then I understood that the pressure would likely continue to increase. When powerful interests feel challenged, they rarely stop after one or two warnings. They test limits. They push further. They look for the moment when a leader might compromise. That evening I spent a long time reflecting on the situation, not as a politician, but as a man responsible for the well-being of millions of citizens. Burkina Faso is not a wealthy country. Development assistance supports important programs. Losing that support could create serious challenges. But there was also another question that I could not ignore. If a leader accepts pressure to silence his conscience, what message does that send to the people he serves? What example does it set for the next generation? Those thoughts stayed with me through the night. And as it turned out, the situation would become even more serious within a matter of hours. Because the next message would not be another warning. It would be something much more direct. An ultimatum. And when that ultimatum arrived, it would force me to make a choice that no leader should ever be forced to make. A choice between faith and power. The moment that demand appeared, the entire world would soon be watching. And the decision I made would surprise many of the people who believed they could control the outcome. By the time the third message arrived, I no longer had any illusions about the direction of the situation. The earlier letters had expressed concern. They had offered warnings wrapped in diplomatic language. But this time, the tone was unmistakable. The document arrived through the same diplomatic channel, and when it was placed on my desk, I sensed immediately that it would contain something different. Not a suggestion, a demand. I opened the envelope slowly. The letter was shorter than the others, but sometimes the shortest letters carry the heaviest meaning. The message began by referring to the previous communications sent earlier that month. It said that Western partners had carefully reviewed the situation and believed that immediate clarification was necessary in order to preserve stable international relations. The phrase sounded calm, but the next paragraphs made it clear that the discussion had reached a decisive point. The letter stated that several international partners believed my public remarks linking the teachings of Jesus with criticism of political corruption had created growing concern. It said these statements were being interpreted as moral accusations directed towards certain governments. Whether that interpretation was fair or not was no longer the issue. The issue was control. Some powerful voices believed that the message needed to be stopped. Then came the part that changed everything. The letter explained that a solution had been prepared. It described what it called a public clarification statement. According to the document, I would be asked to deliver a short message to international media outlets. In that message, I would state that my personal religious beliefs should not be connected to the political leadership of Burkina Faso. I would also say that future speeches would avoid quoting religious teachings when addressing political matters. In other words, the teachings of Jesus would no longer appear in my public discussions about corruption, justice, or leadership. They would become private, separate, silent. The letter described this as a necessary step to prevent misunderstandings and preserve constructive partnerships. But the meaning was obvious. They wanted the message removed, and they wanted the world to see that it had been removed. The statement had already been drafted. All I needed to do was read it. The document even explained how the announcement would take place. A live international broadcast would be arranged. Several major global news networks would participate. Studios in Paris, London, and Washington would connect to the broadcast originating in Ouagadougou. The message would be delivered to millions of viewers around the world. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal diplomatic clarification. But the final paragraph revealed the real weight behind the request. Because this time, the letter included conditions. Clear conditions. If I agreed to deliver the statement, cooperation would continue as normal. Development assistance would remain in place. Security support would remain in place. International partnerships would remain stable. But if I refused, the consequences could be serious. The letter explained that several forms of cooperation might be reconsidered. Development aid could be suspended. Economic sanctions could be discussed. Certain international organizations might review their political support for the government of Burkina Faso. In simple terms, the choice they were presenting was clear. Either remain silent about faith in public leadership, or risk losing international support. I placed the letter down on the desk and read the final paragraph once more. The message did not hide the reality. It said the decision was now in my hands. For a moment, the room felt very quiet. Captain Omar Yabre stood across the desk. He had already read the document before bringing it to me. Neither of us spoke immediately, because both of us understood what the message meant. This was no longer a diplomatic conversation. It was pressure, and it was pressure designed to force a specific choice. Faith or position, conviction or power. The strange thing was that the people who wrote that letter probably believed the choice would be easy. They believed that political leaders always choose power. History has shown that many do. But they underestimated something. They underestimated the strength of conscience. They underestimated the meaning that faith holds for millions of people across the world. For many individuals, faith is not a decoration placed beside political life. It is the foundation that guides moral decisions. That evening, I spent several hours thinking carefully about the implications of the letter, not only for myself, but for my country. Burkina Faso is home to more than 22 million people. Many families struggle with poverty. Nearly 40% of the population lives below the poverty line. Development assistance helps support important programs: healthcare, education, food security. Losing that support could create real difficulties for many communities. And that reality weighed heavily on my mind. Leadership is not about personal pride. Leadership is about responsibility. The decision I made would not affect only my reputation. It could affect millions of citizens. Yet there was another question that I could not ignore. If a leader agrees to silence his conscience in exchange for political security, what remains of leadership? If moral conviction can be traded for financial assistance, then the meaning of leadership disappears. That night I opened the Bible and read again the passages that have guided me since my youth. I remembered the story of Jesus standing before powerful authorities. He did not choose silence. He spoke truth, even when the consequences were severe. Those reflections stayed with me through the night. And the following morning, another detail arrived that made the situation even more serious. The letter had not only presented an ultimatum, it had also set a date, a specific day when the world would be watching, the day when the statement would be delivered, and the day when I would either accept the conditions placed before me or refuse them. That date would arrive very soon, and when it came, the cameras of the world would be focused on Ouagadougou. Many people believed they already knew what I would say, but they were wrong, because what happened on that day would surprise them all. After reading the ultimatum, one detail in the letter stayed in my mind more than any other: the date. Diplomatic messages often leave room for negotiation. They speak about future discussions, ongoing dialogue, or meetings that may take place weeks or months later. But this message did not offer that kind of space. The letter contained a very specific plan, and it contained a very specific moment when the entire situation would be made public. A live international broadcast had already been arranged. The date was clearly written: March 15th, 2026. Only a few days away. The broadcast would originate from Ouagadougou, but it would not remain within the borders of Burkina Faso. The program would be connected to several major international media studios. Television networks such as CNN in the United States, BBC World News in the United Kingdom, and France 24 in France would participate in the broadcast. Through those networks, the message would reach audiences across Europe, North America, Africa, and many other parts of the world. Media analysts estimated that more than 60 million viewers might watch the statement. The purpose of the event was clear. They wanted the world to see a correction, a clarification, a moment when the president of Burkina Faso would publicly state that his personal faith had no place in political leadership. They believed that once that message was delivered, the controversy surrounding my speeches would disappear. They also believed that the broader message I had been speaking about justice, corruption, and moral responsibility would quietly fade away. Because if the source of that message withdrew it publicly, the conversation would likely end. From a strategic perspective, the plan was clever. If I delivered the prepared statement, Western governments could say the issue had been resolved. If I refused, the broadcast would still expose the disagreement to the world. Either way, the moment would be recorded. Either way, the decision would become public. The letter explained that the international media partners had already reserved the broadcast time. Satellite connections had been scheduled. Producers had prepared questions. Everything was ready. All that remained was my answer. When I finished reading that section of the document, I placed it back on the desk. For a few seconds, I simply looked at the date, March 15th. Only a few days away. The speed of the schedule told me something important. They did not want long discussions. They did not want negotiations that might stretch for months. They wanted a quick resolution. Pressure works best when time is limited. When a person has very little time to think, fear can sometimes lead them to accept conditions they might otherwise refuse. But leadership requires the opposite. Leadership requires calm reflection, even when the clock is moving quickly. Later that afternoon, I met again with several advisors. We reviewed the details of the proposed broadcast. Everyone in the room understood what the event was designed to accomplish. The networks involved were among the most influential international media organizations. A message delivered through them would travel around the world within minutes. Clips from the broadcast would appear on social media. Newspapers would report the story. Political analysts would debate the meaning of the statement. In a matter of hours, the narrative would be established. And the narrative they expected was simple. A young African president had spoken too boldly. Then, after diplomatic discussions, he had clarified his position and removed religion from political speech. The story would end there. But something inside me resisted that expectation, not because I wanted conflict, and not because I wanted attention, but because the deeper issue was not about media narratives. It was about truth. The teachings of Jesus are not political weapons. They are moral guidance. They remind leaders that power must be used with humility. They remind societies that wealth should never replace compassion. If those teachings disappear from public conversation, something important is lost, especially in a world where corruption continues to harm millions of people. That evening, I walked through the gardens of the presidential residence. Sometimes quiet moments help clarify difficult decisions. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of evening life in the city. Children playing, motorbikes moving through the streets, families preparing meals. Those ordinary sounds reminded me of the people whose lives could be affected by my decision. More than 22 million citizens live in Burkina Faso. Many of them face daily challenges. Farmers who depend on uncertain rainfall. Workers who struggle to support their families. Students who dream of opportunities beyond poverty. Leadership is never only about personal conviction. It is about protecting the well-being of those people. And that responsibility weighed heavily on my mind. But there was another thought that would not leave me. If a nation allows outside pressure to decide what its leaders may or may not believe, what remains of independence? Political independence without moral independence is incomplete. History has shown that nations must defend both. The date of the broadcast approached quickly. Each day the pressure became more real. International journalists began contacting the presidential office. Some of them had already heard rumors about the upcoming announcement. Speculation was spreading. Many believed they knew what would happen. They believed the statement would be read. They believed the situation would end quietly. But inside the presidential palace, the real decision had not yet been made, because the next part of the letter revealed something even more serious. The broadcast was not simply an opportunity to speak. It was the final step in the ultimatum. If I accepted the prepared statement, everything would remain stable. But if I refused, the consequences described in the letter would begin. That was the moment when the true weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was approaching rapidly, and soon the cameras of the world would turn toward Ouagadougou. What happened when those cameras began recording would surprise many people. But before that moment arrived, there was still something else I needed to confront. The full meaning of the conditions placed before me, because the ultimatum was not only about a statement. It was about something deeper. They were asking me to choose between two things that should never be forced into opposition: faith and leadership. When I read the final section of the ultimatum, I understood that the situation had reached its most serious point. The earlier parts of the letter had described the broadcast. They had explained the prepared statement. They had outlined the diplomatic concerns that Western partners claimed to have. But the last section of the document removed all ambiguity. It explained the consequences. In diplomatic communication, consequences are often written in careful language. Rarely do such letters contain threats that sound direct. Instead, they speak about reconsideration, review, or adjustments. But anyone familiar with international politics understands what those words usually mean. And in this letter, those meanings were impossible to ignore. The message explained that if I agreed to deliver the prepared statement during the international broadcast, the existing partnerships between Burkina Faso and its Western partners would continue without interruption. Development assistance would remain in place. Security cooperation would remain in place. Diplomatic relations would remain stable. In other words, nothing would change. But the letter also described what could happen if I refused. And this time, the possibilities were described more clearly than before. The document said that development assistance programs might be suspended. Financial support that helps fund healthcare, education, and humanitarian programs could be paused while governments reviewed the political situation. It also mentioned the possibility of economic measures. Certain financial relationships could be reassessed. Trade agreements could be reconsidered. International lending institutions might evaluate their partnerships with Burkina Faso again. But the final sentence carried the most serious implication of all. The letter suggested that some international organizations could begin discussions about the political legitimacy of the current government. That phrase has enormous weight in global diplomacy. When legitimacy is questioned, recognition can be challenged. When recognition is challenged, political isolation can follow. And when political isolation begins, the economic and diplomatic consequences can spread quickly. I read that paragraph several times, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be certain that I was interpreting it correctly. There was no misunderstanding. The message was clear. They were presenting a choice: either accept the conditions placed before me, or face the possibility of international pressure that could affect the entire country. For a moment I sat quietly at the desk, looking at the final line of the letter. Captain Omar Yabre remained across the room, waiting for my reaction. The situation was no longer a simple diplomatic disagreement. It had become a test of how far external pressure could influence the internal conscience of a leader. After a few minutes, I placed the document on the table. I spoke slowly. Do they truly believe that faith can be negotiated? Yabre did not answer immediately. Finally, he said something very simple. Some people believe everything can be negotiated. His words were honest. In the world of politics, many decisions are indeed negotiable. Trade agreements, military cooperation, infrastructure projects, economic policy, those matters are part of diplomacy. But faith is different. Faith belongs to the conscience, and conscience cannot be traded like a contract. That evening, I asked my advisors to gather for a longer discussion. We spoke about the economic realities facing Burkina Faso. Our country has more than 22 million citizens. Nearly 40% of them live below the poverty line. Many communities depend on development programs supported by international partners, healthcare programs, food assistance, education initiatives. Those programs help real families. Losing financial support could create serious challenges. Every leader must consider those consequences carefully. No responsible president ignores the practical needs of his people. But there was another reality that also needed to be considered. If a government accepts pressure to silence its conscience, what message does that send to its citizens? What message does it send to young people who are watching their leaders? It would mean that moral conviction can be traded for financial support. That truth can be adjusted to satisfy powerful interests. And that faith should remain hidden when it becomes inconvenient. Those ideas troubled me deeply, because faith has never been meant to hide. Throughout history, faith has often been the voice that challenges injustice. In the United States, many leaders of the civil rights movement spoke openly about their Christian faith. Pastors preached about justice. Churches became places where people gathered to demand equal dignity. Faith did not remain silent during those moments. It became the moral language of the movement. That same moral language exists around the world today. Millions of people draw strength from it. They draw courage from it. They draw hope from it. If leaders are pressured to silence that voice, something valuable disappears from public life. That night, long after the meeting with my advisors had ended, I remained awake. The palace had grown quiet. Most of the lights in the building were off, but the questions raised by the letter remained. I walked slowly through the corridors and eventually returned to my office. There, on the desk, the document still lay open. Its final sentence seemed to summarize the entire situation. Choose. Choose between faith and position. Choose between conscience and power. But the more I reflected on that sentence, the more I realized something important. The choice they were presenting was based on a misunderstanding. They believed faith and leadership were separate. They believed faith should remain private while politics operates according to power. But for many people, faith is precisely what reminds leaders how power should be used. Without conscience, leadership becomes dangerous. Without moral guidance, power becomes destructive. History has shown that lesson again and again. In the early hours of the morning, I opened the Bible once more. I read passages that have guided believers for centuries. Passages about justice, about humility, about courage. And I remembered something simple. Jesus never promised that standing for truth would be easy. He simply taught that truth matters. Those reflections stayed with me as the date of the broadcast approached. March 15th was now only days away. Soon the cameras of the world would be watching. Many people believed they already knew what would happen. They believed the prepared statement would be read. They believed the situation would end quietly. But inside my heart, another decision was slowly becoming clear. A leader can lose power. Power can be taken away by elections, by politics, by international pressure. But when a leader loses conscience, something far more important disappears. And that realization would guide me when the day of the broadcast finally arrived. Because when the cameras turned on, the world expected one message, but what they heard instead would surprise them all. After the ultimatum had been delivered and the date of the broadcast confirmed, the days that followed became some of the most reflective days of my life. Outwardly, the routines of government continued. Meetings were held. Security briefings were delivered. Ministers arrived with reports about agriculture, infrastructure, and the ongoing fight against extremist violence in the Sahel. The machinery of government never stops moving. Yet behind those daily responsibilities, my mind was focused on a single question. What decision would best serve both truth and the people of Burkina Faso? Leadership is rarely simple. Many people believe presidents make decisions quickly, guided by instinct or political calculation. But the most serious decisions require quiet reflection, especially when millions of lives may be affected. Burkina Faso is home to more than 22 million people. Nearly 40% of them live below the poverty line. In many rural regions, families struggle with drought, unstable food supplies, and limited economic opportunity. Development assistance from international partners helps support programs that address those challenges. Hospitals receive supplies. Farmers receive agricultural support. Schools receive funding. These programs are not abstract numbers in government reports. They represent real help for real families. That reality weighed heavily on my thoughts. If financial support were suspended, the consequences would be felt not in government offices, but in villages and neighborhoods across the country. And as president, I could not ignore that responsibility. Each evening during those days, I spent time speaking with trusted advisors. Some of them were military officers. Some were economists. Some were spiritual leaders who understood the moral dimension of the decision. The conversations were honest. No one in the room tried to simplify the situation. Everyone understood that the pressure described in the ultimatum was real. One advisor reminded me that powerful nations often use economic influence to shape international behavior. It is not unusual in global politics. Countries rely on partnerships, and partnerships sometimes include expectations. But another advisor raised a different concern. He asked a question that stayed with me. What happens, he said, if the world sees that Burkina Faso changed its voice because of pressure? That question reached beyond economics. Because nations, like individuals, also possess dignity. If a government appears willing to silence its convictions when powerful voices demand it, that image can weaken the confidence of its own people. Citizens begin to wonder whether their leaders truly represent them, or whether those leaders simply respond to external pressure. During those discussions, I listened carefully to every perspective. No decision of this magnitude should be made without hearing the wisdom of others. Yet in the quiet moments after those meetings ended, the final responsibility remained mine. One evening, after the last advisors had left, I walked outside the presidential residence again. The sky above Ouagadougou was clear. The city lights stretched into the distance. Burkina Faso is not a wealthy nation, but its people possess remarkable strength. For generations, they have endured hardship while continuing to work, raise families, and build communities. I thought about the farmers who wake before sunrise to cultivate dry soil. I thought about the teachers who work in classrooms with limited resources but still try to inspire young minds. I thought about the mothers who prepare meals each evening while hoping their children will grow up in a better world. Leadership is ultimately about serving those people. Not foreign governments, not international media, but the citizens who trust their leaders to protect both their welfare and their dignity. During those days of reflection, another thought also became clear. Faith is not a political strategy. It is not a tool to gain support or influence. Faith is a compass. It guides conscience. And when leaders follow that compass honestly, it shapes the way they speak about justice and responsibility. If that compass is silenced, leadership becomes hollow. That realization did not immediately remove the difficulty of the decision, but it helped clarify the principles involved. The ultimatum had asked me to choose between faith and political position. Yet the more I reflected on the situation, the more I realized that the true choice was different. It was not simply about personal belief. It was about whether moral truth should remain part of public leadership. If leaders refuse to speak about justice because it creates discomfort for powerful interests, corruption will always remain hidden. But when leaders speak openly about moral responsibility, societies begin to examine themselves more honestly. Those thoughts returned to me again and again during the days leading up to the broadcast. Meanwhile, preparations for the international program continued. Media organizations confirmed the technical arrangements. Satellite connections were tested. Producers discussed the structure of the broadcast. Journalists began circulating rumors that an important statement would soon come from Ouagadougou. Across social media, speculation grew. Some commentators predicted that the issue would be resolved quietly. Others suggested that diplomatic pressure would force a compromise. Very few people imagined that the broadcast might unfold differently. But inside the presidential palace, the decision was slowly becoming clearer. The deadline approached. March 15th was now very close. Soon the cameras would be positioned. The microphones would be activated. Millions of viewers around the world would be watching, and they expected to hear the prepared statement that had been written for me. Yet something inside me knew that the moment would not unfold the way they expected. Because leadership is not only about protecting power, it is about protecting truth. When the day of the broadcast finally arrived, the decision would no longer remain private. The entire world would hear it. And the moment that followed would become one of the most surprising moments of my presidency. Because when the cameras began recording, something happened that none of the people who wrote the ultimatum had anticipated. The morning of March 15th, 2026 arrived with a strange sense of calm. For several days, the atmosphere around the presidential palace had been filled with quiet tension. Advisors moved through the halls with careful expressions. Messages from journalists and diplomatic offices continued to arrive. Technicians from international media networks had already begun preparing equipment for the broadcast. Yet when the morning finally came, the city of Ouagadougou looked almost peaceful. From the windows of the palace, I could see the usual rhythm of daily life. Motorbikes moved through the streets. Vendors arranged small stalls along the roads. Children in school uniforms walked toward classrooms. Most of them had no idea that millions of people around the world would soon be watching a moment that might shape the future of their country. Inside the palace, preparations for the broadcast were already underway. Television crews had arrived earlier in the morning. Engineers were setting up cameras and adjusting lights inside a carefully prepared room where the address would be delivered. Microphones were tested repeatedly. Satellite connections were confirmed with studios in several countries. Producers from international media organizations moved quietly through the building, checking schedules and coordinating communication between Ouagadougou and the studios abroad. According to the technical teams, the broadcast would be carried simultaneously by several major international news networks. Studios in Paris, London, and Washington were already prepared to connect to the signal. Television channels such as CNN in the United States, BBC World News in the United Kingdom, and France 24 in France would all carry the broadcast. Media analysts later estimated that more than 60 million viewers across the world would watch the event live. The purpose of the broadcast had been clearly communicated to them. They expected a statement, a short declaration that would clarify my position and remove religion from my political speeches. The document containing that statement had already been prepared and delivered. It sat on the desk inside the room where the broadcast would take place. Several copies had been printed. The words were carefully written, neutral, diplomatic, designed to close the controversy. In the hours before the broadcast, I met briefly with several members of my team. No one attempted to influence my decision. They already knew that the responsibility belonged to me alone. Yet I could see concern in their faces. They understood the risks involved. Burkina Faso is not a powerful nation in economic terms. Development assistance from international partners helps support important programs for millions of citizens. If those partnerships were disrupted, the consequences could become difficult. But at the same time, everyone in that room also understood something deeper. Leadership cannot exist without integrity. A government that abandons its moral convictions under pressure risks losing something more valuable than financial support. It risks losing the trust of its own people. Shortly before the broadcast began, the producers informed us that the international connections were ready. Studios across Europe and North America were waiting. The cameras were prepared. The signal would go live within minutes. I walked slowly toward the room where the address would be delivered. The atmosphere inside felt unusually quiet. Bright lights illuminated the desk. Several cameras faced forward, their lenses directed toward the chair where I would sit. Behind the cameras stood technicians, journalists, and producers observing the scene with professional attention. On the desk in front of the chair lay the prepared statement, a few sheets of paper, words written by people who believed they already knew what I would say. The producers began counting down the final minutes. In distant studios, presenters were introducing the broadcast to viewers around the world. Millions of people were turning their attention toward Ouagadougou. Many of them believed they were about to witness the resolution of a diplomatic disagreement. They expected a clarification, a brief announcement, a statement that would quietly bring the controversy to an end. The cameras switched on. Red lights appeared on the equipment, signaling that the broadcast had begun. Across the world, the image of the room inside the presidential palace appeared on television screens. In homes across the United States, Europe, Africa, and many other regions, viewers watched as the broadcast started. I took my seat at the desk. For a moment, I looked down at the prepared statement. Then I looked up toward the cameras. The room remained silent. Technicians stood motionless. Producers listened through their headsets as the signal traveled through satellites across continents. The statement lay in front of me. All I needed to do was read it. If I read those words, the situation would likely end quietly. The diplomatic tension would disappear. The pressure described in the ultimatum would be resolved. But the decision I had been reflecting on for days was already clear in my mind. And in the next few seconds, the entire world would hear it. Because what happened in that moment was not what the authors of the ultimatum expected. The cameras were recording. Millions of people were watching. And the statement they believed I would read would remain untouched on the desk. The next words spoken in that room would surprise everyone. When the broadcast began, the room felt very still. The cameras were already transmitting the image across continents. In studios thousands of kilometers away, presenters were watching carefully, waiting for the statement that had been prepared. On the desk in front of me lay the document that many people expected me to read. A short declaration, a clarification, a message that would separate faith from leadership and quietly close the situation. The paper was placed neatly in the center of the desk, positioned so the cameras could clearly see it. The words had been written with diplomatic precision. There was nothing aggressive in them, nothing dramatic. They were simply designed to remove the voice of faith from the public conversation. For a few seconds, I looked down at those pages. The room remained silent. Behind the cameras, technicians stood without speaking. Producers listened through their headsets as the signal moved through satellites to studios in Europe and North America. Millions of viewers were now watching. Many of them assumed the speech had already been decided. They believed I would read the statement exactly as it had been written. But those few seconds of silence were important. Because during that moment, I remembered everything that had brought me there. The letters, the warnings, the ultimatum, the suggestion that development aid might disappear, the reminder that powerful nations could reconsider diplomatic support. All of that pressure had been designed to lead to this exact moment. A moment when I would quietly accept the conditions placed before me. Yet another thought also returned to my mind. A leader can lose position. History shows that power never lasts forever. Presidents leave office. Governments change. Political systems evolve. But when a leader abandons his conscience, something far deeper is lost. And that loss cannot be repaired by diplomacy. So I reached forward and touched the prepared statement. The cameras captured the movement. For a brief second, many viewers probably believed I was about to begin reading. Instead, I lifted the paper gently from the desk. Then I placed it to the side. The room became even quieter. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simple, but it changed everything. Because in that moment, everyone watching realized that the broadcast was no longer following the expected script. The prepared statement remained on the desk, untouched. I looked directly into the camera. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I began to speak. My voice was calm, not angry, not defiant, just honest. I said something very simple. My faith in Jesus Christ is not something that can be abandoned because of political pressure. In the control rooms of the international networks, producers suddenly understood that the situation had changed. The statement they expected was not being delivered. The broadcast was no longer predictable. I continued speaking. I explained that leadership carries responsibility not only to political alliances but also to moral truth. A president may lose power. A government may face criticism. But when leaders silence their conscience, they lose something more important than office. They lose integrity. I also made something else clear. My faith had never been used to attack any specific nation. The teachings of Jesus speak about justice, humility, and compassion. Those values are not directed against countries. They are directed against injustice. Corruption harms people in every part of the world. It steals opportunities from the poor. It turns public office into personal wealth. When leaders speak against corruption using the language of faith, they are not creating conflict. They are reminding society of its responsibilities. As I spoke those words, the broadcast continued traveling across the world. Millions of viewers listened. Some were surprised. Some were probably uncomfortable. Others may have felt encouraged. But in that moment, I was no longer thinking about political reactions. I was thinking about something simpler. Truth should not be negotiated. Then I said another sentence that later appeared in many reports about the broadcast. I said that no powerful nation has the right to decide the faith of another people. Faith belongs to individuals. It belongs to communities. It belongs to the conscience. No government, no alliance, and no political institution should attempt to control it. Those words were not spoken with hostility. They were spoken with clarity, because the issue was never about rejecting cooperation with other nations. Burkina Faso continues to value international partnerships, but partnership must respect dignity. True cooperation cannot require the abandonment of conscience. When I finished speaking, the room remained silent for a moment. The cameras were still recording. The broadcast had lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes had already changed the direction of the entire situation. Across international newsrooms, journalists were quickly discussing what had just happened. The prepared statement had not been read. Instead, the president of Burkina Faso had delivered a completely different message. Some commentators would soon call it surprising. Others would call it controversial. But for me, it was simply the honest answer to the ultimatum that had been delivered days earlier. When the broadcast ended, the technicians slowly lowered their equipment. The red lights on the cameras disappeared. The signal to the international studios was cut, and the room returned to quiet. Yet I knew something important had just happened. The message spoken in that room was no longer private. It had traveled across the world. People in dozens of countries had heard it. And whether they agreed or disagreed, the moment had already become part of the global conversation. But the broadcast itself was not the end of the story, because the message I delivered that day was meant for more than political leaders. It was meant for anyone who believes that conscience should never be controlled by power. And the final part of that message would be shared immediately after the cameras stopped recording, because the story was not only about refusing pressure, it was about reminding the world of something deeper. That faith, justice, and human dignity must never be separated. After the cameras stopped recording, the room slowly returned to normal. The technicians began gathering equipment. Producers spoke quietly into their headsets, communicating with studios across the world. Journalists were already preparing their first reports about what had just happened. But for me, the most important part of that moment had not been the reaction of the media. It had been the message itself. Because the words spoken during that broadcast were not directed only to governments or international institutions. They were meant for ordinary people everywhere. People who understand the value of conscience. People who believe that moral truth should not disappear when it becomes inconvenient. When I looked into the camera during that broadcast, I was aware that millions of viewers were watching. Many of them were older men and women who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between power and integrity. Some had experienced political pressure in their own lives. Some had watched leaders rise and fall, and many understood something that history teaches again and again. Power can influence many things, but it cannot control truth forever. That is why I chose to end the broadcast with a message that was simple and direct. I said that a leader can lose position. Political power is temporary. Every presidency eventually comes to an end. But if a leader abandons conscience, the loss is permanent. A nation can recover from economic hardship. It can recover from political disagreements. But when integrity disappears from leadership, trust disappears with it. And without trust, no government can truly serve its people. I also spoke about something that extends beyond politics: faith. Faith does not belong to governments. It does not belong to institutions. Faith belongs to individuals and communities. It lives in the hearts of people who seek justice, compassion, and humility. No political pressure can remove that faith from the human spirit. History has shown this many times. Empires have tried to control belief. Authorities have tried to silence moral voices. Yet faith continues to appear in new generations, reminding societies of their responsibilities. The teachings of Jesus are a clear example of this truth. For more than 2,000 years, those teachings have spoken about compassion, humility, and justice. They have reminded the powerful that authority should serve the weak. They have reminded the wealthy that wealth must not replace mercy. And they have reminded every human being that dignity belongs to all people. Those teachings were never meant to remain hidden in private spaces. They were meant to guide how people treat each other, including leaders. During the broadcast, I also made something else very clear. My message was not against cooperation with other nations. Burkina Faso values international partnerships. We welcome dialogue. We welcome economic cooperation. And we welcome friendships with countries around the world. But true partnership must be built on respect. Respect for sovereignty. Respect for dignity. And respect for conscience. A relationship that requires silence about moral truth cannot be called partnership. It becomes something closer to control. And the world does not need more control. It needs more honesty. It needs leaders who speak openly about corruption and injustice, not to create conflict, but to encourage reform. After the broadcast ended, the reactions from across the world began appearing quickly. Some commentators expressed surprise. Others debated the political consequences. Diplomatic analysts discussed what the moment might mean for international relations. But beyond the world of politics, something more important was happening. Ordinary people were sharing the message. Across Africa, across Europe, across the United States, across many parts of the world, people were discussing the deeper question behind the event. Should leaders remain silent about moral truth when powerful voices demand it? Or should conscience guide leadership, even when the consequences are uncertain? That question does not belong only to presidents. It belongs to every person who faces pressure to compromise their values. Teachers who refuse to accept corruption. Workers who refuse dishonest practices. Parents who teach their children to stand for truth. In that sense, the message spoken during the broadcast was not only about Burkina Faso. It was about something universal. The courage to remain faithful to conscience. Because when individuals choose integrity over convenience, societies become stronger. And when leaders do the same, the example spreads far beyond one country. The broadcast lasted only a short time. Yet the message carried within those minutes continues to travel. Not through official statements or diplomatic reports, but through conversations among people who recognize the importance of moral courage. And that message leads naturally to the final part of this story, because the events of that day were never meant to create division. They were meant to remind the world of something hopeful, that even in a world filled with political pressure, human beings still have the ability to choose truth. And that choice can shape the future in ways no one expects. After the cameras stopped recording, the room slowly returned to normal. The technicians began gathering equipment. Producers spoke quietly into their headsets, communicating with studios across the world. Journalists were already preparing their first reports about what had just happened. But for me, the most important part of that moment had not been the reaction of the media. It had been the message itself. Because the words spoken during that broadcast were not directed only to governments or international institutions. They were meant for ordinary people everywhere. People who understand the value of conscience. People who believe that moral truth should not disappear when it becomes inconvenient. When I looked into the camera during that broadcast, I was aware that millions of viewers were watching. Many of them were older men and women who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between power and integrity. Some had experienced political pressure in their own lives. Some had watched leaders rise and fall. And many understood something that history teaches again and again. Power can influence many things, but it cannot control truth forever. That is why I chose to end the broadcast with a message that was simple and direct. I said that a leader can lose position. Political power is temporary. Every presidency eventually comes to an end. But if a leader abandons conscience, the loss is permanent. A nation can recover from economic hardship. It can recover from political disagreements. But when integrity disappears from leadership, trust disappears with it. And without trust, no government can truly serve its people. I also spoke about something that extends beyond politics. Faith. Faith does not belong to governments. It does not belong to institutions. Faith belongs to individuals and communities. It lives in the hearts of people who seek justice, compassion, and humility. No political pressure can remove that faith from the human spirit. History has shown this many times. Empires have tried to control belief. Authorities have tried to silence moral voices. Yet faith continues to appear in new generations, reminding societies of their responsibilities. The teachings of Jesus are a clear example of this truth. For more than 2,000 years, those teachings have spoken about compassion, humility, and justice. They have reminded the powerful that authority should serve the weak. They have reminded the wealthy that wealth must not replace mercy. And they have reminded every human being that dignity belongs to all people. Those teachings were never meant to remain hidden in private spaces. They were meant to guide how people treat each other, including leaders. During the broadcast, I also made something else very clear. My message was not against cooperation with other nations. Burkina Faso values international partnerships. We welcome dialogue. We welcome economic cooperation. And we welcome friendships with countries around the world. But true partnership must be built on respect. Respect for sovereignty, respect for dignity, and respect for conscience. A relationship that requires silence about moral truth cannot be called partnership. It becomes something closer to control. And the world does not need more control. It needs more honesty. It needs leaders who speak openly about corruption and injustice. Not to create conflict, but to encourage reform. After the broadcast ended, the reactions from across the world began appearing quickly. Some commentators expressed surprise. Others debated the political consequences. Diplomatic analysts discussed what the moment might mean for international relations. But beyond the world of politics, something more important was happening. Ordinary people were sharing the message. Across Africa, across Europe, across the United States, across many parts of the world, people were discussing the deeper question behind the event. Should leaders remain silent about moral truth when powerful voices demand it? Or should conscience guide leadership, even when the consequences are uncertain? That question does not belong only to presidents. It belongs to every person who faces pressure to compromise their values. Teachers who refuse to accept corruption. Workers who refuse dishonest practices. Parents who teach their children to stand for truth. In that sense, the message spoken during the broadcast was not only about Burkina Faso, it was about something universal. The courage to remain faithful to conscience. Because when individuals choose integrity over convenience, societies become stronger. And when leaders do the same, the example spreads far beyond one country. The broadcast lasted only a short time, yet the message carried within those minutes continues to travel. Not through official statements or diplomatic reports, but through conversations among people who recognize the importance of moral courage. And that message leads naturally to the final part of this story. Because the events of that day were never meant to create division. They were meant to remind the world of something hopeful. That even in a world filled with political pressure, human beings still have the ability to choose truth. And that choice can shape the future in ways no one expects.